Rain mixed with spilled gasoline outside the Oakland Medical Center, reflecting the spinning red lights of 3 idling ambulances. 98 leather-clad men, heavily tattooed members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, stood in a crushing, suffocating silence. Hardened enforcers, road captains, and lifers, men who had bled on asphalt and broken bones for their death head patches, now openly wept into their calloused, grease-stained hands. They weren't crying for a fallen brother. They were weeping for a 14-year-old street kid in worn-out, duct-taped sneakers, a nameless phantom who had walked into a firestorm of gunfire and shattered glass just to pull their beloved matriarch from the burning jaws of hell. To be completely invisible in a city like Oakland, you have to learn the rhythm of the shadows. 14-year-old Leo knew this better than anyone. He didn't exist in any official capacity, no social security number that mattered, no school records past the 3rd grade, and no parents looking for him since his mother's fatal overdose in a damp motel room 3 years prior. Leo was a ghost, haunting the alleys behind the industrial strip of San Pablo Avenue, surviving on half-eaten diner food and the spare change that rolled into the street gutters. But even ghosts have places they call home. For Leo, home was a hollowed-out space behind a towering green dumpster in the rear alley of a notoriously rough dive bar called the Iron Piston. From the outside, the bar looked like a relic of a bygone, violent era. Its neon sign had been broken for a decade, flashing only an angry, sputtering red eye. The front curb was almost always lined with heavy American iron custom Harley-Davidson choppers and Dynaglides, gleaming with chrome and dripping with oil. This wasn't a hipster joint or a college hangout. This was a stronghold for the Oakland charter of the Hells Angels. Men with the infamous winged skull on their backs drank here, conducted business here, and defended the pavement outside like it was sovereign territory. Most people crossed the street to avoid walking past the leather-clad giants who smoked on the sidewalk. But Leo watched them from the safety of his alley. He watched Brick Sullivan, a towering man with a braided beard and scars tracking up his forearms, kickstart his panhead. He watched Tommy Two-Tone Reynolds polishing his spokes on Sunday mornings. They were terrifying men, but they had a code, a fierce loyalty that Leo, in his deep, aching loneliness, secretly envied. At the center of this violent, loud, grease-stained universe was Ruthie. Ruthie wasn't a biker, but she commanded more respect than the heavily armed men who drank her whiskey. She was 68 years old, a woman whose face was a map of deep laugh lines and unspoken tragedies. She was the widow of Big Jim Walker, one of the original legendary figures of the Oakland Charter, back in the days of Sonny Barger. When Jim died of lung cancer 15 years ago, the club had sworn a blood oath to protect Ruthie and the bar she owned. To the men in the patched leather vests, she was Mama. She settled their disputes, slapped the backs of their heads when they disrespected her waitresses, and kept a loaded 12-gauge shotgun under the mahogany bar, which she knew exactly how to use. Leo first met Ruthie on a freezing Tuesday night in November. He had been digging through the bar's trash, desperate for discarded fries, when the heavy steel back door swung open. Leo froze, expecting a beating. Instead, Ruthie stood there, a cigarette dangling from her painted lips, holding a fresh, steaming plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. "Trash is for the rats, kid," she had croaked, her voice like grinding sandpaper. "You're a lot of things, but you ain't a rat. Eat." She didn't ask for his name. She didn't call the police. She just set the plate on a milk crate and went back inside. From that night on, a silent pact was formed. Every evening at 10:00 p.m., the back door would open, and a hot meal would be waiting on the crate. Sometimes she left an old blanket. Once, in the dead of winter, she left a heavy, worn-out leather jacket that smelled of stale tobacco and old exhaust, a jacket that kept Leo from freezing to death. Over the months, Leo became fiercely protective of the old woman in his own invisible way. He started sweeping the alley, stacking the empty kegs neatly so she wouldn't trip on her smoke breaks. When a couple of local junkies tried to pry open the bar's back window, Leo threw heavy stones from the roof until they ran off, bleeding. Ruthie never knew who had scared them away, but the next night, there was an extra slice of cherry pie on the milk crate. Leo felt, for the first time in his life, that he belonged to an ecosystem. He was the silent sentry of the alley, and Ruthie was the tough, gravel-voiced angel who kept his ribs from poking through his skin. He watched the Hells Angels come and go, roaring in like a thunderstorm, and leaving in a cloud of blue exhaust. He knew their faces, their bikes, their routines. He knew that on the second weekend of August, almost the entire charter rode out to a massive regional gathering up north. He knew that during those 3 days, the Iron Piston would be nearly empty. Just Ruthie, a young prospect named Rat, wiping down the tables, and the ghosts of San Pablo Avenue. It was an open secret in the neighborhood that the bar was left vulnerable during the annual run. And in a city where respect is measured in blood and territory, vulnerability is a dinner bell for wolves. The heat wave that struck Oakland that August weekend was brutal and suffocating. The air smelled of melting asphalt and ozone. It was a Saturday night, and just as Leo had observed, the front of the bar was eerily quiet. Instead of 30 Harleys lined up on the curb, there was only Rat's beat-up Sportster and Ruthie's old Ford pickup in the back. Inside, the jukebox was playing a low, mournful Johnny Cash tune. Leo sat in his usual spot behind the dumpster, eating a plate of leftover chili, the heavy leather jacket draped over his thin shoulders despite the heat. It felt like armor. At 11:15 p.m., the rhythm of the street changed. It wasn't the rumbling thunder of V-twin engines. It was the high-pitched, aggressive whine of 3 unmarked, matte black SUVs pulling up to the curb. Doors slammed. Heavy, rapid footsteps echoed on the concrete. Leo peeked out from the mouth of the alley. 15 men piled out of the vehicles. They weren't bikers. They wore tactical vests over plain t-shirts, heavy combat boots, and bandanas pulled up over their noses. They carried baseball bats, heavy steel chains, and Leo caught the unmistakable dull gleam of firearms tucked into waistbands. This wasn't a random brawl. It was a coordinated hit. Word had traveled through the city's grim underworld that a newly formed syndicate, eager to seize control of the local narcotics trade, was looking to make a massive, violent statement, trashing a legendary Hells Angels bar and humiliating their matriarch, while the main crew was hundreds of miles away, was the perfect way to send a message to the entire West Coast. Leo's breath hitched in his throat. He watched the leader of the group, a massive, bald man with a jagged scar running from his ear to his collarbone, kick the heavy oak front doors of the Iron Piston open with a boot. "Everybody on the floor, now," the man roared. Leo scrambled up the rusty fire escape of the adjacent building to get a view through the high side windows of the bar. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He wiped the grime from the glass and peered down into the dimly lit room. The chaos erupted instantly. Rat, the young prospect desperate to earn his full patch, didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy wooden bar stool and swung it at the first man through the door. The stool shattered against the intruder's shoulder, but there were too many of them. 3 men swarmed Rat, driving him to the floor. Steel-toed boots rained down on the young man until his body went limp, blood pooling on the checkered linoleum. The 2 older patrons at the end of the bar tried to run, but were ruthlessly clubbed down from behind. Glass shattered as the intruders began systematically destroying the establishment. They smashed the neon beer signs, kicked in the front of the jukebox, and swept hundreds of bottles of premium liquor off the shelves, creating a toxic, highly flammable river of alcohol across the floor. Behind the bar, Ruthie stood her ground. She hadn't survived 4 decades married into the Hells Angels by being a coward. She didn't scream. She reached under the counter and pulled out the old pump-action 12-gauge. The unmistakable clack-clack of a shell chambering briefly silenced the room. "Get the hell out of my bar," Ruthie snarled, aiming the heavy barrel squarely at the scarred leader's chest. For a second, the men froze, but the leader just smiled. A cruel, cold expression. "You're out of your depth, old lady. Your boys are in another state. Put it down, and maybe we just burn the building. Keep holding it, and you burn with it." Ruthie didn't blink. She pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing happened. The gun jammed. A horrible, agonizing mechanical failure, caused by a rusted firing pin that hadn't been tested in years. The leader laughed. A harsh, barking sound. He lunged across the bar, grabbing the barrel of the shotgun and ripping it from her frail grip. He backhanded Ruthie with terrifying force. She crumpled to the floor behind the bar, out of Leo's line of sight. "Burn it!" the leader shouted to his men. "Burn the whole damn thing to the ground." One of the men pulled a road flare from his tactical vest, struck the cap, and tossed the blinding red, sparking tube directly into the river of spilled 100 proof liquor. The fire didn't start slowly. It exploded. A massive, roaring wall of blue and orange flames instantly devoured the center of the room, climbing the wood-paneled walls and igniting the vintage club banners hanging from the ceiling. Thick, choking black smoke billowed upward. The syndicate members laughed, abandoning the destruction and rushing back out the front doors to their waiting SUVs, leaving Rat bleeding out on the floor, and Ruthie trapped behind the burning mahogany counter. Up on the fire escape, Leo watched the flames rapidly consume the interior. The heat radiating through the window was already unbearable. The rational, survivalist instinct that had kept him alive on the streets screamed at him to run, to climb down, disappear into the night, and find a new alley. This wasn't his fight. He was a nobody, a ghost. But as he looked down at the smoke filling the room, he remembered the steaming plates of meatloaf. He remembered the heavy leather jacket draped over him while he slept in the freezing rain. He remembered the gravelly voice that told him he wasn't a rat. Leo didn't climb down to run away. He scrambled down the iron stairs, hit the alley floor, and sprinted full speed toward the heavy steel back door of the iron piston. The back door was locked from the inside. Leo slammed his shoulder against it, but the heavy steel wouldn't budge. Smoke was already bleeding through the cracks in the frame. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his chest. He looked around wildly and spotted a heavy, cast-iron drain grate resting over a gutter in the alley. Adrenaline surged through his malnourished frame. He gritted his teeth, hoisted the incredibly heavy iron grate with both hands, took 3 running steps, and hurled it through the small, reinforced security window set into the metal door. The glass shattered inward with a sickening crunch. Leo didn't wait. He wrapped his hands in the oversized sleeves of his leather jacket and reached through the jagged shards, ignoring the glass slicing into his forearms. He found the deadbolt, twisted it, and threw his weight against the door. It flew open, and a wall of superheated, toxic black smoke rolled over him, dropping him to his knees. The heat was like a physical blow to the face. The interior of the bar was an inferno. The liquor had acted as an accelerant, turning the wooden stools, the tables, and the floorboards into a raging bonfire. The roar of the flames was deafening, sounding like a freight train speeding through the room. "Ruthie!" Leo screamed, coughing violently as the smoke seared his lungs. "Ruthie!" He couldn't see anything. He dropped flat to his stomach, where the air was marginally cooler and clearer, and began to crawl through the kitchen, toward the main bar area. The linoleum was blistering hot under his hands. Every instinct begged him to turn back. As he crawled through the swinging doors into the main room, he saw her. Ruthie was lying on the floor behind the heavy mahogany bar, trapped. A massive, burning overhead liquor rack had collapsed from the ceiling, pinning her right leg. She was conscious, but barely, violently coughing up black soot, weakly trying to push the flaming timber off her leg. The fire was creeping closer, catching the edges of her apron. Leo scrambled over the broken glass and spilled liquor, ignoring the flames licking at his own boots. He reached her side. "Kid," Ruthie rasped, her eyes wide with shock and pain as she looked at him through the smoke. What are you doing here? Run. Get out. I'm not leaving you." Leo yelled over the roaring fire. He grabbed the burning timber, pinning her leg. He didn't have gloves. The wood was blazing hot, instantly searing the flesh of his palms. Leo screamed in agony, tears streaming down his soot-stained face, but he refused to let go. He planted his boots, closed his eyes, and pulled with every ounce of strength he had in his 90-pound body. With a sickening groan, the timber shifted just enough. "Pull your leg out!" Leo shrieked. Ruthie bit down on her lip, stifling a scream of pain, and yanked her crushed leg free. The ceiling above them began to groan dangerously. The structural supports were failing. Leo grabbed Ruthie under her arms. She was a heavy woman, and Leo was just a starving teenager, but pure, unfiltered desperation fueled him. He dragged her backward, inch by agonizing inch, away from the burning bar and toward the kitchen doors. "Leave me, Leo," Ruthie coughed, her eyes rolling back. "You can't carry me. Go." It was the first time she had ever called him by his name. He didn't know how she knew it, but it sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through his veins. "Shut up, Mama," Leo grunted, mimicking the tough talk he'd heard the bikers use. "We're going." They reached the kitchen. The roof over the main bar collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a massive shockwave of fire and debris outward. A heavy, burning chunk of ceiling joist shot through the air, striking Leo squarely in the back, directly between his shoulder blades. The force of the blow drove him to the floor, pinning him momentarily. The heavy leather biker jacket Ruthie had given him absorbed the worst of the fire, saving his flesh from instantly charring, but the sheer blunt force shattered 3 of his ribs. Leo tasted blood filling his mouth. His vision went white, then swam with dark spots. His body told him it was over. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. "Trash is for the rats, kid." Her voice echoed in his fading consciousness. He looked up. Ruthie was reaching for him, her hand trembling. With a guttural, animalistic scream, Leo twisted his body, shrugging off the burning joist. He ignored the excruciating, blinding pain in his chest. He grabbed Ruthie by the collar of her shirt and dragged her the final 20 feet through the kitchen. The smoke was so thick now that it was pitch black. He navigated purely by memory, feeling the tile under his boots, bumping against the stainless steel prep tables. He saw the dim, hazy light of the alley ahead. With one final, monumental heave, Leo dragged Ruthie over the threshold and out the back door, collapsing with her onto the cold, wet concrete of the alley. They were out. Above them, the windows of the iron piston blew out violently, shooting tongues of fire into the night sky. In the distance, the wail of fire engines and police sirens finally began to cut through the heavy air. Leo lay on his back, staring up at the smoke-filled sky. He couldn't draw breath past the shattered ribs in his chest. His hands were blistered and bloody. He slowly turned his head. Ruthie was breathing, her chest rising and falling, safe from the flames. Leo smiled, a bloody, soot-stained smile. He closed his eyes, let his head fall back against the concrete, and let the darkness take him. The first engine company from the Oakland Fire Department arrived 4 minutes after the front windows blew out. By then, the iron piston was no longer a building. It was a roaring, superheated furnace painting the night sky a bruised, angry orange. The blast from the high-pressure water hoses hitting the flaming roof hissed like 1,000 angry vipers, sending blinding clouds of white steam into the choking black smoke. Captain David Miller, a 20-year veteran of the department, kicked his way through the smoldering debris of the front entrance, flanked by 2 firefighters carrying heavy axes. The heat inside was still radiating at over 400 degrees. Sweeping their heavy halogen flashlights through the toxic fog, the beam caught a crumpled, bloody shape near the shattered remnants of the jukebox. "We got a victim," Miller bellowed through his respirator. It was Rat. The young Hells Angels prospect was unrecognizable. His face beaten into a swollen, purple mass, his leather cut soaked in his own blood. He wasn't breathing. The firefighters hoisted him by his arms and legs, dragging his limp body out onto the wet pavement where paramedics immediately descended upon him, tearing open his bloody shirt to begin aggressive chest compressions. Meanwhile, in the pitch-black, flooded rear alley, paramedic Sarah Jenkins was sweeping the perimeter with her flashlight. The water from the fire hoses was cascading down the brick walls, pooling around her heavy boots. As she moved her beam past the dented green dumpster, the light caught the dull reflection of a soot-covered boot. "Over here. I need a backboard and an oxygen kit. Now," Sarah screamed into her radio, sprinting toward the figures huddled against the wet concrete. When she slid to her knees beside them, her heart dropped into her stomach. She recognized Ruthie instantly. Everyone in this sector of Oakland knew the gravel-voiced matriarch of the Hells Angels. Ruthie was unconscious, her pulse thready and weak, her face painted with black soot, and her right leg gruesomely bruised and mangled from the fallen timber. But it was the figure beside her that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was a child, a boy, no older than 14. Though his severe malnourishment made him look even younger, he was wearing an oversized, scorched leather motorcycle jacket that was practically fused to the torn fabric of his t-shirt. His hands, Sarah grimaced. His palms were severely burned, the flesh blistered and raw from gripping something unimaginably hot. But that wasn't the worst of it. His chest was caved in at a horrifying, unnatural angle. Sarah pressed 2 fingers to the boy's neck. "He's in cardiac arrest." The crush injury to his thorax caused a tension pneumothorax. His lung collapsed and crushed his heart against his rib cage. Another paramedic, a burly man named Jackson, arrived with the crash cart. "Who is this kid? He looks like a street urchin. I don't care if he's the ghost of Christmas past. He's dying on my pavement," Sarah barked. "Get the decompression needle. I have to vent his chest before we can even try to jumpstart his heart." The alley became a frantic blur of flashing red and blue lights, shouting voices, and the tearing of medical packaging. Sarah ripped the scorched leather jacket open, wincing at the deep purple bruising that covered Leo's frail chest. She found the second intercostal space, directly below his collarbone, and drove a thick, 14-gauge hollow needle straight into his chest cavity. A sharp, audible hiss of trapped air escaped the needle. Instantly, the pressure inside Leo's chest released. "Starting compressions," Jackson yelled, interlocking his hands over Leo's sternum. He had to be incredibly careful. He could feel the shattered pieces of Leo's ribs shifting under his palms. Crunch, crunch, crunch. "Push 1 milligram of epinephrine," Sarah ordered, frantically establishing an intraosseous IV line directly into the bone marrow of Leo's shin, because his veins were too collapsed from dehydration and shock to find with a standard needle. "Come on, kid," Sarah whispered, her own tears mixing with the rain and soot on her face. "You didn't pull this woman out of a burning building just to die in the dirt. Come on." After 2 agonizing minutes of CPR and a violent jolt from the defibrillator paddles, the portable EKG monitor let out a sharp, erratic beep. Then another. "We have a pulse," Jackson shouted, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It's weak, but he's back. Load him up. Level 1 trauma at Oakland General. Call ahead and tell them we need the pediatric trauma surgeon and the burn unit standing by," Sarah commanded. Within seconds, Leo and Ruthie were loaded into separate ambulances. The doors slammed shut, and the heavy diesel engines roared to life, their sirens wailing into the night as they tore away from the smoldering, flooded ruins of the Iron Piston. Behind them, the bar was a blackened, hollowed-out shell, its neon sign finally dark, the sanctuary of the outlaws reduced to wet ash. Up on the fire escape, a single, bloody handprint remained on the shattered glass of the window, the only proof that a guardian angel had been there at all. 250 miles north, deep in the heavily forested mountains of Mendocino County, the Hells Angels Oakland Charter was in the middle of their annual summer run. A massive bonfire roared in the center of a secluded private campground. 98 custom motorcycles were parked in perfectly aligned rows, their chrome reflecting the dancing flames. Men with heavy beards, heavily tattooed arms, and patched leather vests were drinking, laughing, and swapping stories of the road. This was their brotherhood, their escape from the grinding pressure of their violent lives back in the city. Silas Buster Hayes, the imposing, broad-shouldered president of the Oakland Charter, sat on a heavy wooden stump near the fire. Buster was a legend in the club, a man who had survived 3 prison stints, 2 bullet wounds, and a knife fight that had left a jagged white scar across his throat. He was ruthless to his enemies but fiercely, unconditionally loyal to his club. His cell phone vibrated violently against his leather chaps. Buster pulled it out, frowning at the screen. It was an unknown number, which usually meant a burner phone, which usually meant trouble. He stood up, stepping away from the loud music and the roar of the fire to answer it. "Yeah," Buster growled, his voice deep and gravelly. "Buster, it's Detective Rollins, Oakland PD." Buster's jaw tightened. Rollins was an old-school gang unit detective. They weren't friends, but they had a mutual, grudging respect. Rollins didn't call unless the sky was falling. "Make it quick, Rollins. I'm off the clock." "The clock just stopped, Buster," Rollins said, his voice unusually somber. "It's the Iron Piston. It's gone." Buster stopped walking. The sounds of the campground seemed to fade into a dull, underwater hum. "What do you mean, gone?" "Burned to the ground, Buster. Total loss. Fire investigators are saying arson. Accelerant everywhere. Looks like a coordinated hit." A cold, dark fury began to coil in Buster's gut. Was anyone inside? There was a heavy pause on the line. "Rat is in surgery. He was beaten to an inch of his life. And, Buster, it's Ruthie." Buster's hand tightened around the phone so hard the plastic casing creaked. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet whisper. "Oakland General, ICU." She inhaled a lot of smoke, and a ceiling beam crushed her leg. "She's stable, but at her age, it's rough." "Who did it?" Buster asked, his eyes staring blankly at the dark tree line. "We're pulling street cameras now. Word on the wire is it's the new syndicate moving up from the south, the ones trying to corner the fentanyl trade. They waited until you boys were out of town to send a message." "They sent a message. All right," Buster said softly. "I'll see you in 2 hours, Rollins." Buster didn't hang up. He crushed the phone in his massive grip, the glass screen shattering under his thumb, and threw the broken device into the trees. He turned slowly and walked back toward the roaring bonfire. His face was a mask of cold, murderous granite. The vice president, a wiry, dangerous man named Chibbs Morgan, saw Buster's face and instantly set his beer down. The surrounding bikers noticed the shift in the atmosphere. The laughter died. The music was turned off. 98 pairs of eyes locked onto their president. "Pack it up," Buster roared, his voice echoing off the mountain pines. "The piston is burned down. Someone put Mama in the ICU." For 2 seconds, there was absolute, stunned silence. Then, the campground erupted into terrifying, chaotic motion. There was no discussion, no voting, no hesitation. Sleeping bags were abandoned. Half-empty whiskey bottles were kicked over. Within 10 minutes, the mountain shook with the deafening, synchronized roar of 98 heavy V-twin engines firing up. Buster kicked his customized road glide into gear, the heavy exhaust barking like a machine gun. He didn't look back as he dumped the clutch and tore out of the campground, kicking up a massive shower of dirt and gravel. Behind him, a 2-mile-long column of headlights cut through the pitch-black mountain roads. They hit Highway 101 South like a guided missile. The speed limit was 65. They were running at 95, riding 2 abreast in a tight, disciplined, terrifying pack. State troopers sitting in highway medians saw the massive, thundering wave of leather and chrome approaching, saw the winged death heads flashing under the streetlights, and wisely turned their cruisers off, letting the armada pass without trying to intervene. There was no police force on the highway equipped to stop 98 furious Hell's Angels riding to avenge their matriarch. The wind tore at Buster's beard. His mind was a chaotic storm of memories. He remembered being 22 years old, bleeding out on a dirty linoleum floor from a rival gang's knife wound, and Ruthie pressing bar towels into his side, holding his hand and keeping him awake until the ambulance arrived. She had hidden his gun. She had saved his life, his freedom, and his soul on more than one occasion. She was the mother none of them had ever had, the only pure thing in their violently broken lives. And someone had put her in the hospital. The 2.5-hour ride took them an hour and 45 minutes. At 3:15 a.m., the thunder hit the streets of Oakland. The massive pack of motorcycles swarmed the front entrance of Oakland General Hospital. They didn't bother finding parking spots. They jumped the curbs, parking their heavy bikes on the manicured lawns, blocking the emergency vehicle bays, shutting down the entire block. Security guards rushed to the glass doors, their eyes wide with absolute panic as almost 100 massive, heavily tattooed men in leather cuts dismounted in grim, furious silence. They didn't yell. They didn't break anything. The sheer, overwhelming presence of their silent, organized rage was far more terrifying than any riot. Buster pushed through the glass doors, closely followed by Chibbs and 10 of his most hardened enforcers. The hospital waiting room, usually filled with crying families and exhausted nurses, went dead silent. A young security guard reached for his radio, his hand trembling violently. "Don't touch that," Chibbs warned quietly, stepping into the guard's personal space. Buster walked directly to the main triage desk. The triage nurse, a veteran who had seen a lot of gang violence, swallowed hard as the giant biker loomed over the counter. "Ruthie Walker," Buster demanded, his voice a low, vibrating rumble. "What floor?" Before the nurse could answer, a pair of heavy double doors swung open, and Detective Rollins stepped out, flanked by 4 armed police officers. "Stand down, Buster," Rollins said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "You can't bring an army in here. You'll lock the whole hospital down." Buster slowly turned his head to look at the detective. "I don't care if I shut down the whole damn city, Rollins. Where is she?" "She's in the ICU on the 4th floor. She's heavily sedated. She's going to live, Buster. But her leg is badly crushed, and the smoke damage to her lungs is severe." Buster closed his eyes, exhaling a long, ragged breath. The tension in his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. "I want to see her." "Only you and Chibbs," Rollins compromised. "The rest of your boys stay down here, and they stay quiet. I mean it, Buster. Don't make me call in the riot squad." Buster turned to his men. He didn't have to shout. He just nodded once. The 96 other bikers silently moved to the edges of the waiting room, claiming the plastic chairs, the floor, the walls. They crossed their heavy arms and waited. The hospital staff realized very quickly that the Hell's Angels weren't there to cause trouble. They were there to stand guard. The fourth-floor intensive care unit smelled of strong antiseptic and bleached linen. The rhythmic, mechanical hissing of ventilators and the steady beeping of heart monitors created a sterile, chilling symphony. Buster and Chibs walked down the hallway, their heavy boots squeaking softly against the polished linoleum, feeling entirely out of place in this pristine environment of life and death. Outside room 412, a tall, exhausted-looking surgeon wearing blue scrubs and a surgical cap pulled low over his forehead was writing on a clipboard. His name tag read, Dr. Eris Caldwell, Chief of Trauma. Detective Rollins introduced them. Dr. Caldwell, this is Silas Hayes. He's essentially Mrs. Walker's next of kin. Dr. Caldwell looked up, taking in the intimidating sight of the two heavily patched bikers. He didn't flinch. He had operated on enough gunshot victims to know not to judge the grieving. Mr. Hayes, Caldwell said, his voice quiet but firm. Mrs. Walker is incredibly lucky. The beam that fell on her fractured her tibia and fibula in multiple places, requiring surgical pins. Her lungs suffered moderate thermal and chemical burns from the toxic smoke. She's resting now. She's tough as nails, but she has a long road of physical therapy ahead of her. Buster nodded slowly. I appreciate you fixing her up, Doc. The club will cover whatever insurance doesn't. Cash. That's not necessary to discuss right now, Caldwell said softly. He hesitated, looking between Buster and the detective. I have a question for you, Mr. Hayes. Who is the boy? Buster frowned, his brow furrowing deeply. What boy? Dr. Caldwell looked confused. The boy who brought her in, the boy who pulled her out of the fire. Chib stepped forward, crossing his arms. The only person with Ruthie tonight was Rat, our prospect. Rollins said he got beaten half to death. Your prospect was found outside, unconscious from blunt force trauma, Caldwell corrected, his tone turning grave. Mrs. Walker was trapped behind the bar when the roof collapsed. She didn't get out on her own. The paramedics found her in the rear alley, a safe distance from the blast radius. She was dragged out. Caldwell pointed down the hall toward the pediatric intensive care wing. The paramedics found a John Doe with her, a boy, roughly 14 years old. According to the burn patterns and the crush injuries on his back, he shielded Mrs. Walker with his own body when the main support joist fell. He physically lifted a burning timber off her leg, suffering third-degree burns to his hands, and then dragged her out through the kitchen. The blood drained from Buster's face. He looked at Chibs, who looked equally stunned. Neither of them spoke. We don't know who he is, Caldwell continued, his voice dropping to a somber whisper. He had no ID, no phone, nothing but the clothes on his back, and an adult-sized leather motorcycle jacket that took the brunt of the fire. He is severely malnourished, suggesting he's a runaway or homeless. And gentlemen, his condition is critical. How critical? Buster rasped. He has 3 shattered ribs, a punctured right lung, severe smoke inhalation, and third-degree burns on his palms and forearms. We had to put him in a medically induced coma and place him on a ventilator to allow his lungs to heal. To be blunt, his body was already starving before the trauma. I do not know if he possesses the physical reserves to survive the night. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the hallway. These were men who dealt in violence, who understood retaliation and brutality. But the concept of absolute, selfless sacrifice from a nameless child shattered their hardened worldview. Can we see him? Chibs asked, his voice thick with uncharacteristic emotion. Through the glass, Caldwell nodded, leading them down the corridor. They stopped outside a large, reinforced glass window looking into pediatric ICU room 3. Inside, the scene was horrifying. The boy lying in the center of the bed was incredibly small, lost amidst a chaotic tangle of tubes, wires, and machines. A thick plastic breathing tube was taped into his mouth, secured to his face. His hands and arms were wrapped in thick, white bandages that looked terrifyingly large against his frail limbs. His chest, bruised black and purple, rose and fell with the mechanical, rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. Buster stepped up to the glass, pressing his massive, scarred hand against the cold pane. He stared at the bruised, soot-stained face of the boy. I've never seen this kid in my life, Buster whispered. Why the hell would a street kid run into a burning building for our mama? Buster. The weak, gravelly voice came from behind them. Buster spun around. Ruthie was being wheeled down the hallway in a hospital bed by two nurses, having just been transferred from the recovery room. She looked pale, her face covered in small bandages from flying glass, a clear oxygen mask strapped over her nose and mouth. Her right leg was elevated and heavily casted. Buster instantly rushed to her side, falling to his knees beside the rolling bed. He gently took her uninjured hand, his massive frame trembling. "Mama," Buster choked out, tears finally breaking through his hardened facade. "I'm so sorry. We weren't there. We weren't there to protect you." Ruthie weakly squeezed his hand, pulling the oxygen mask down to her chin. "Stop your blubbering, Silas. I ain't dead yet." She coughed weakly, a wet, rattling sound. She turned her head, looking past Buster, her eyes locking onto the glass window of room 3. A tear slipped down her weathered cheek. Is he alive?" she whispered. "He's clinging to it, Mama," Chibbs answered softly. "Doc says he's in a bad way. Do you know him? Doc says he pulled you out." Ruthie stared at the small figure connected to the machines. "His name is Leo. He's a ghost. Lives behind the dumpster in the alley." Buster looked confused. "A homeless kid? Why would he risk his life for you?" Ruthie looked back at Buster, her eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. "Because for the last 8 months, I've been leaving him a plate of food on the back step. I gave him old Jim's riding jacket when the snow hit in January. I didn't think he ever spoke. But tonight, when that ceiling came down, he ran straight into hell to get me." She grabbed the lapel of Buster's leather cut, pulling the giant man closer with surprising strength. "Those bastards from the south side," Ruthie growled, her voice shaking with rage and sorrow. "They came in swinging bats. They put Rat in a coma. They poured liquor everywhere and laughed while they lit the match. I was dead, Buster. I was burning. And this little 90-pound street rat carried me out on his broken back." She let go of his vest, pointing a trembling finger at the glass window. "That boy in there," Ruthie commanded, looking at Buster, Chibbs, and Detective Rollins. "That boy is blood now. Do you hear me? He's club. If he dies, I want the men who did this erased from the earth. And if he lives, nobody, and I mean nobody, ever touches a hair on his head again." Buster stood up slowly. He looked at the frail, broken boy breathing through a machine. He looked at the heavy, scorched leather jacket, Jim's jacket resting in a plastic evidence bag in the corner of the room. The president of the Hells Angels turned to Chibbs. "Call down to the lobby. Tell the boys what happened. Tell them who the kid is." Chibbs nodded, pulling out his phone. Buster turned to Detective Rollins. The detective was watching the exchange, knowing full well he was witnessing the spark that would ignite a bloody war on the streets of Oakland. "Rollins," Buster said, his voice terrifyingly calm, completely devoid of the rage he had shown earlier. This was a cold, calculated certainty. "You have exactly 48 hours to find the syndicate members who lit the match. You find them, and you lock them deep inside a steel cage where I can't reach them." Rollins swallowed hard. "And if I don't?" Buster looked back through the glass at Leo. "If you don't find them in 48 hours, there won't be enough left of them for you to arrest." The clock began ticking the moment Buster Hayes walked out of Oakland General. By sunrise, the city of Oakland felt different. The usual chaotic thrum of the streets had been replaced by a suffocating, heavy tension. The Hells Angels had effectively mobilized an army. 98 fully patched members, plus dozens of prospects and hang-arounds, fanned out across the Bay Area. They weren't riding in noisy packs. They were operating in dead silence, a coordinated, terrifying dragnet pulling tight around the city's criminal underbelly. Detective Rollins knew the local narcotics syndicate was led by a ruthless operator named Victor Trench Lawson. Trench was the scarred man who had kicked in the doors of the Iron Piston. He was ambitious, violent, and currently hiding behind a small army of hired guns. But Rollins also knew that the police bureaucracy moved like molasses, requiring warrants, wiretaps, and approvals. Buster's men required none of these things. In a dimly lit auto body shop in East Oakland, Chibbs Morgan stood over a terrified, low-level street dealer tied to a hydraulic car lift. The dealer, a kid named Scrappy, had been caught trying to move a brick of Trench's fentanyl on Hells Angels territory. "I don't know where Trench is," Scrappy sobbed, blood leaking from a busted lip. "He went to ground after the fire. Nobody has seen him." Chibbs leaned in close, the smell of stale coffee and cigarettes rolling off him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Scrappy, you're missing the point. We aren't the cops. We don't need a confession. My president gave me a deadline, and I am out of patience. You have 10 seconds to give me an address, or I hit this green button, and this lift crushes you against the ceiling. Wait, wait, Scrappy shrieked as Chibs reached for the console. The shipyards. Pier 39. There's an abandoned dry dock warehouse. Trench uses it to bring in shipments. He's got 15 guys with him. Heavy artillery. They're waiting for a boat to take them to Mexico until the heat dies down. Chibs released the button and pulled out his encrypted cell phone. He sent a single text message to Buster. Pier 39. Dry dock 4. He's running. Across town, Rollins received a different tip from an informant. He saw the location, and his blood ran cold. He knew the Angels were already on their way. He grabbed his radio, sprinting to his unmarked cruiser. Dispatch, this is Detective Rollins. I need SWAT and every available unit to Pier 39, immediately. We have a heavily armed standoff imminent. The skies over Oakland broke open, unleashing a torrential, freezing downpour. Lightning spider webbed across the gray clouds as Buster led a column of 50 motorcycles down the slick, oil-stained access roads of the port. The roar of their engines was swallowed by the crashing thunder and the mechanical groaning of the massive shipping cranes. They parked a quarter-mile from Dry Dock 4. Buster dismounted, pulling a heavy, pump-action shotgun from a leather scabbard on his bike. The other men followed suit, arming themselves with tire irons, chains, and sidearms. They didn't look like a motorcycle club anymore. They looked like a tactical military unit executing a siege. Inside the cavernous warehouse, Trench Lawson paced nervously. He had heard the thunder, but as he looked out the grimy, rain-streaked windows, he saw the horrifying reality. The perimeter was surrounded by men in leather cuts. "They found us," one of Trench's mercenaries yelled, racking the bolt of an assault rifle. "How the hell did they find us so fast?" "Shut up and take your positions," Trench barked, his scarred face twisting into a mask of desperate rage. "If they breach those doors, you light them up." But the Hells Angels didn't breach the front doors. They were street fighters, and they knew the geography of their city better than any cartel. While Buster stood in plain sight in the pouring rain, drawing the mercenaries' attention, Chibs and a dozen enforcers had scaled the rusted fire escapes and breached the skylights on the roof. The assault began not with a shout, but with the shattering of glass from above. Trench's men fired blindly into the ceiling, but it was too late. Heavy chains dropped into the darkness, followed by hardened bikers who descended like shadows. The warehouse erupted into violent, chaotic hand-to-hand combat. Gunfire flashed in the gloom, illuminating the brutal melee. Buster kicked open the side-loading doors, storming into the warehouse just as Trench tried to sprint for a speedboat tied to the rear dock. Buster didn't shoot. He leveled the shotgun at Trench's knees and racked the slide. The sound alone froze the syndicate leader in his tracks. "You burned my house," Buster growled, stepping into the dim light. "You put my mama in the hospital, and you almost killed a kid who has more heart in his pinky finger than you have in your entire miserable body." Trench raised his hands, a cowardly sweat mixing with the rain on his face. "Hayes, listen to me. It was strictly business. We can make a deal. I have money." Buster swung the heavy wooden stock of the shotgun like a baseball bat, catching Trench squarely in the jaw. The sickening crunch of bone echoed over the storm. Trench crumpled to the concrete, unconscious before he even hit the ground. Suddenly, the warehouse was bathed in blinding, strobing red and blue lights. SWAT teams swarmed the loading docks, laser sights painting the chests of every man inside. Detective Rollins stepped through the front doors, his weapon drawn, his eyes scanning the carnage. Trench's men were disarmed and bleeding on the floor. Not a single Hell's Angel had taken a fatal hit. Rollins looked at Buster, who stood over Trench's broken body, the shotgun resting casually on his shoulder. "You cut it close, Silas," Rollins said, his breath pluming in the cold air. Buster checked his heavy steel wristwatch. 46 hours, Rollins. "I told you I'd find him. He's breathing, barely. Bag him up and get him out of my city." Rollins signaled the SWAT officers to move in and cuff the syndicate members. As Buster walked past the detective, Rollins grabbed his arm. "The hospital called while I was on my way here," Rollins said softly. "It's the boy. He crashed. He's coding." Buster froze. The adrenaline of the raid vanished, replaced by an icy, paralyzing dread. He dropped the shotgun, sprinted to his motorcycle, and tore out of the shipyards like a man possessed, the entire club roaring desperately behind him. By the time Buster and his men reached Oakland General, the rain was coming down in sheets. They didn't care. The parking lot was filled with 98 Hells Angels, standing shoulder to shoulder in the pouring rain, staring up at the illuminated window of the fourth-floor pediatric ICU. Inside, Room 3 was a nightmare of alarms. Dr. Caldwell and his team were frantically working over Leo's frail body. The trauma to his ribs had caused internal bleeding that had gone undetected beneath the massive bruising. His blood pressure had plummeted, and his heart had stopped for a second time. "Push another round of epi. Charge paddles to 200. Caldwell shouted, pressing the defibrillator to Leo's small, scarred chest. "Clear." The boy's body arched off the bed, but the monitor maintained a flat, agonizing tone. In the hallway, Buster, Chibs, and Ruthie, who had insisted on being wheeled out of her own room despite her injuries, watched through the glass. Ruthie was weeping silently, her hands pressed against her mouth. Buster gripped the metal railing so hard his knuckles turned white. "Don't you quit on me, kid," Buster whispered against the glass, tears streaming freely down his weathered, scarred face. "Don't you dare quit. You fought too hard." Down below, in the rain, the 98 bikers stood in absolute silence. Hardened men, criminals to the law, outcasts to society, removed their heavy leather cuts and held them over their hearts. The rain washed the grease and dirt from their faces, mixing with the tears they didn't bother to hide. They wept openly for the ghost of San Pablo Avenue. They wept for the boy who had shown them what true courage looked like. "Charge to 250. Clear," Caldwell yelled. The shock rocked Leo's body. The room held its breath. Beep. It was faint. Beep, beep, beep. A steady rhythm returned to the monitor. Caldwell slumped against the wall, pulling down his surgical mask, exhaling a massive, shuddering breath. He looked up at the window, making eye contact with Buster, and gave a slow, exhausted nod. Buster fell back against the opposite wall, sliding down to the linoleum floor, burying his face in his massive hands as he let out a choked sob of profound relief. Chibs placed a heavy hand on his president's shoulder, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "He's a fighter, Buster," Chibs choked out. "Just like Mama." Ruthie smiled through her tears, resting her head against the back of her wheelchair. "He's not a ghost anymore," she whispered. 3 weeks later, the morning sun filtered through the blinds of a private recovery room on the 4th floor. The chaotic beeping of monitors was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of the hospital ventilation and the distant murmur of traffic. Leo slowly opened his eyes. Everything hurt. His chest felt like it was wrapped in an iron band, and his hands were encased in thick, white, itchy bandages. He blinked, trying to clear the haze of pain medication from his mind. He wasn't in the alley. He wasn't behind the dumpster. He was in a clean, soft bed. He slowly turned his head. Sitting in a chair next to his bed was a massive man with a braided beard, reading a worn paperback copy of a Western novel. Leo recognized him instantly. It was the giant biker who rode the Panhead. Brick? No, Buster, the boss. Leo tried to speak, but his throat was raw from the ventilator tube that had been removed 2 days prior. He let out a dry, raspy cough. Buster instantly dropped the book and leaned forward, pouring a small cup of water and holding a straw to Leo's lips. "Easy, kid. Just small sips." Leo drank greedily. He looked around the room. The windowsills were overflowing with flowers, balloons, and terrifyingly large stuffed animals that clearly didn't belong to a motorcycle gang but were bought with genuine, awkward care. "Where is she?" Leo managed to croak. "Is Ruthie?" "She's fine," Buster smiled, a surprisingly warm expression that transformed his terrifying face. "She's in physical therapy down the hall, getting fitted for a walking boot. She's been driving the nurses completely insane." Leo let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 3 weeks. He looked down at his bandaged hands. "The bar, the fire." "The bar burned," Buster said quietly. "But bricks and wood can be rebuilt. You saved the only thing in that building that mattered." Buster stood up and walked to a small closet in the corner of the room. He reached inside and pulled out a leather motorcycle jacket. It was Big Jim's old jacket, the one Ruthie had given Leo. It was charred, heavily singed on the back, and smelled faintly of smoke, but it had been meticulously cleaned and repaired as best as possible. Buster laid it gently across the foot of Leo's bed. "We had the club tailor fix the lining. Buster said, his voice thick with emotion. But we left the scorch marks on the back. A man's scars tell his story, Leo. And yours. Yours is a hell of a story. Leo stared at the jacket. Why are you here? He asked, his voice trembling. I'm just a street rat. No, Buster said, stepping closer and resting a heavy, gentle hand on Leo's blanketed leg. You were a street kid. You were invisible, but you stepped into the fire when grown men ran away. You bled for this club, Leo. You bled for our mama. The door to the room swung open. Ruthie was wheeled in by Chibs. She looked bruised and tired, but her eyes sparked with that familiar, fierce fire. When she saw Leo awake, a massive smile broke across her weathered face. Look at you, Ruthie croaked, wheeling herself right up to the bed and taking Leo's bandaged hand in hers. Tougher than a $2 steak. I told you trash is for rats, didn't I? Tears welled up in Leo's eyes. He had never had anyone look at him the way Ruthie and these giant, terrifying men were looking at him now. Not with pity, but with absolute, unwavering respect. I don't have anywhere to go, Leo whispered, the fear of the alley creeping back into his mind. When they discharge me, I don't have a home. Buster and Chibs exchanged a look. Buster reached into his leather vest and pulled out an envelope, dropping it onto Leo's chest. What's this? Leo asked. Adoption papers, Buster said plainly. My wife and I signed them yesterday. The judge expedited the process, considering the circumstances and the persuasive nature of our lawyer. You're coming home with me, kid. You have a bedroom, a dog, and a terrifying amount of uncles who are waiting to teach you how to rebuild a carburetor. Leo stared at the envelope, his vision blurring with tears. A sob ripped from his chest, aggravating his healing ribs, but he didn't care. He cried, finally releasing the years of terror, loneliness, and starvation. Ruthie leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his frail shoulders, kissing the top of his head. Welcome to the family, Leo, she whispered. Buster walked over to the window and opened the blinds entirely. Hey kid, look down there. Leo carefully shifted his weight and looked out the fourth-floor window. Lined up in perfect, gleaming rows in the hospital parking lot were 98 custom Harley-Davidsons, and standing beside them, looking up at the window, were 98 members of the Hells Angels. When they saw Buster give a thumbs up from the window, the men didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They simply unzipped their leather cuts, revealing the white t-shirts underneath. Printed on the chest of every single shirt, over their hearts, was a single, bold phrase: Leo's Army. In unison, 98 men kicked their engines to life, sending a deafening, thunderous roar of respect echoing off the hospital walls and into the Oakland sky. The ghost of San Pablo Avenue was dead. In his place, a legend was born. The ashes of the Iron Piston eventually gave way to a new foundation, rebuilt by calloused hands and unwavering loyalty. The story of the homeless boy who walked into an inferno to save a matriarch became folklore on the gritty streets of Oakland, a testament to the unpredictable nature of courage. Leo, once a phantom haunting the gutters, traded his invisibility for a brotherhood forged in fire and blood. He found a father in a hardened outlaw, a mother in a fierce survivor, and 98 uncles who rode like thunder. The tears shed outside that hospital weren't a sign of weakness. They were the baptism of a fractured soul finally finding its sanctuary. In a world defined by violence and discarded lives, Leo proved that family isn't born from bloodlines, but from the desperate, beautiful choice to walk through the flames for someone else.